Li Wei walked into her new classroom at Pine Tree School. She was 11 years old and had just moved from China to America with her father 3 months ago. Every morning, she felt scared going to school. Her father, Mr. Zhang, worked as a doctor at the city hospital. He had brought them to America so Li Wei could have a better life, but school was not going well for her. Li Wei walked to her seat quietly, holding her school bag close. A group of girls, led by Katie, the most liked girl in class, started whispering and laughing. "Here comes the girl who can't even talk right," Katie said out loud. Li Wei's face turned red as she sat down. She knew good English, but when she spoke, her accent was different from others. This made her feel shy, so she stayed quiet most of the time. At lunchtime, Li Wei sat by herself, like she did every day. She opened her lunchbox and smiled a little. Her father had made her favorite dumplings that morning to make her happy. But before she could eat, Katie and her friends walked past her table. "What's that weird smell?" Katie said loudly. "Oh, it's that strange Chinese food again." One of Katie's friends knocked Li Wei's lunchbox off the table. The dumplings fell all over the floor. Other kids started laughing, and Li Wei felt tears coming to her eyes. That night, Li Wei sat at her kitchen table doing her homework. She tried to hide that she was sad, but her father noticed something was wrong. Mr. Zhang saw how quiet his daughter had become. She used to tell him happy stories about school and talk about new friends, but not anymore. When he asked about her day, she just said, "Okay," and looked down at her plate. She didn't even eat her favorite noodles for dinner. Mr. Zhang worried about his daughter. The happy, chatty girl he knew was becoming quiet and sad. He didn't know that tomorrow something big would happen at school. This would force both father and daughter to face their problems. What Mr. Zhang would do next would change everything, not just for Li Wei, but for the whole school. The next day started badly for Li Wei. During math class, Mrs. Brown asked her to solve a problem on the blackboard. Li Wei knew the answer. She had always been good at math in China. She walked to the front, picked up the chalk with shaking hands, and started writing. When she finished, Mrs. Brown smiled and said she was correct, but Katie raised her hand. "Mrs. Brown, I can't understand what Li Wei wrote. Her numbers look weird," Katie said. Some students giggled. Li Wei looked at her writing. She had used Chinese number styles without thinking. Her face got hot with shame as Mrs. Brown asked her to write it again, the American way. Walking back to her seat, Li Wei heard someone whisper, "If she can't even write numbers right, why is she even here?" During art class, things got worse. The teacher asked everyone to draw and write about their favorite memory. Li Wei drew a beautiful picture of the Shanghai Spring Festival she celebrated before coming to America. She worked hard on her English writing underneath, checking each word carefully. When it was time to share, Katie went first, showing her drawing of a beach vacation. Everyone clapped. Then it was Li Wei's turn. As soon as she held up her drawing, Katie and her friends started making faces. "What are those weird red things?" one girl asked about the lanterns in Li Wei's picture. When Li Wei tried to explain, her voice came out soft and shaky. She mixed up some words, and more kids started laughing. The art teacher told everyone to be quiet, but Li Wei could see she was also having trouble understanding the story. Li Wei couldn't take it anymore. She ran out of the classroom with tears running down her face. She locked herself in a bathroom stall and took out her phone, the one her father had given her for emergencies. With trembling fingers, she typed a message to her father. "Baba, please come get me. I can't stay here anymore." She didn't know that this message would lead to something much bigger than just going home early. Her father's response would start a chain of events that nobody at Pine Tree School saw coming. Mr. Zhang was checking a patient's heart when his phone buzzed. Reading Li Wei's message, his heart sank. He had never seen his daughter ask to leave school before. Even on her worst days, she always stayed strong. He told the hospital he had a family emergency and drove to Pine Tree School as fast as he could. When he reached the school office, he found Li Wei sitting there with red eyes and messy hair. The principal, Mr. Davis, was waiting for him. "Mr. Zhang, Li Wei ran out of her art class today," the principal explained. "We need to talk about her behavior." But when Mr. Zhang saw his daughter's tear-stained face, he knew there was more to the story. "Li Wei, tell me what happened," Mr. Zhang said softly in Chinese, sitting next to her. At first, Li Wei just shook her head, but then the words came pouring out. She told him everything: the lunchbox incident, the math class shame, the laughing during art class. She told him about Katie and her friends, about feeling alone every day, about how much she missed their life in China. Mr. Davis listened, looking uncomfortable as Mr. Zhang translated. "I understand this is difficult," the principal said, "but running out of class is not the answer. Li Wei needs to learn to fit in better." These words made Mr. Zhang's face turn serious. He remembered his own struggles when he first came to America for medical school, but he had been an adult. His little girl was facing this all alone. "No, Mr. Davis," Mr. Zhang said firmly, standing up. "It is not just Li Wei who needs to learn. This school needs to learn too." His voice was quiet but strong. "I have been too patient, thinking things would get better, but now I see that being quiet is not the answer." He looked at his daughter, who had never seen her gentle father look so determined. "Li Wei, we are not running away from this problem. Tomorrow, we come back with a plan." What he did next would surprise not only the principal, but the entire school community, showing them all a different way to handle differences. That evening, Mr. Zhang called in sick to the hospital for the next day. He sat at his kitchen table with Li Wei, making a special plan. They stayed up late, writing notes, making drawings, and practicing what they would say. Li Wei watched her father make phone calls to other Chinese families in their neighborhood. She had never seen him so busy and focused outside of his doctor work. The next morning, instead of going to his hospital job, Mr. Zhang walked into Pine Tree School with Li Wei. But this time, they weren't alone. Behind them came Mrs. Lin and her son from the Chinese restaurant downtown, Mrs. Wang, who taught weekend Chinese classes, and 3 other Chinese families whose children went to different schools. They all carried big bags and boxes. Mr. Davis looked surprised when the group walked into his office. "What's all this?" he asked. Mr. Zhang smiled and said, "We are here to teach, not to complain." He handed the principal a paper. It was a plan for a special day at school, a day of sharing Chinese culture with everyone. Mr. Zhang had already talked to the school board the night before, and they had agreed to his idea. The principal read the paper slowly. Mr. Zhang's plan was simple but clever. The Chinese families would spend one whole school day sharing their culture with every class. There would be Chinese food tasting, calligraphy lessons, stories about Chinese festivals, and even a short language class. The best part was that the Chinese children, including Li Wei, would help lead these activities. "But what about regular classes?" Mr. Davis asked, looking worried. Mr. Zhang's smile grew bigger. "Sometimes the best lessons don't come from books," he said. "My daughter has been trying to learn your way for months. Maybe it's time for everyone to learn a little bit of her way too." Looking at all the determined faces in his office, Mr. Davis slowly nodded. He didn't know that this unusual day would change his school in ways nobody expected. The special day started with morning assembly. The school hall was filled with whispers as students saw the Chinese families setting up colorful displays. Li Wei stood next to her father on the stage, wearing her favorite red dress from Shanghai. For the first time in months, she held her head high, even though her heart was beating fast. Mr. Zhang spoke first, telling his own story of coming to America. He talked about being scared to speak English at first, about missing home, and about how kind people had helped him become a doctor. Then he said something that made everyone stop and think, being different is not wrong. It's like having an extra gift to share with others. The day was split into different activities. In the first class, Mrs. Lin taught everyone how to use chopsticks. Even Katie had trouble picking up the small candies they practiced with. When she dropped hers for the 5th time, Li Wei quietly showed her a better way to hold them. To everyone's surprise, Katie said, "Thank you," with a small smile. During the calligraphy class, Li Wei helped teach her classmates how to write their names in Chinese characters. Students who usually ignored her now crowded around her desk, amazed at how she could turn their English names into beautiful Chinese symbols. "This is so cool," said Tommy, one of Katie's friends. "Can you show me how to write my mom's name too?" The best part came at lunchtime. All the Chinese families had prepared different foods for everyone to try. The same cafeteria where Li Wei had once felt ashamed of her dumplings now smelled wonderful with different Chinese dishes. Students lined up excitedly to taste everything. Li Wei heard someone say, "This is way better than pizza." She looked over and saw it was Madison, who had knocked over her lunchbox just days ago. But it wasn't just the students who were changing. The teachers watched in surprise as quiet students like Li Wei, confidently explain their culture to others. Mrs. Brown, the math teacher, even asked Li Wei to show the class how numbers were written in Chinese. This time, when Li Wei walked to the blackboard, nobody laughed. The afternoon activities brought even more surprises. In the school playground, Mr. Zhang and the other parents set up stations for Chinese games. Li Wei taught her classmates how to play Chinese jump rope, a game she used to enjoy during breaks in Shanghai. Soon the playground was filled with laughter as students jumped and twisted, trying to follow her instructions. At another station, Mrs. Wang taught traditional Chinese paper folding. The same students who had once made fun of Li Wei's weird drawings now sat quietly, concentrating hard as they tried to make paper cranes. Katie, who usually led all the teasing, kept messing up her crane. Instead of getting angry, she asked Li Wei for help. Working together, they finally made a beautiful red paper crane. "You're actually really good at teaching," Katie said softly, looking a bit ashamed of her past behavior. The most touching moment came during story time. Li Wei's father shared a famous Chinese story about a young girl who worked hard to help her family. As he told the story, with Li Wei helping to translate some parts, he noticed something amazing. The students who usually caused trouble were listening with full attention. Even the teachers were leaning forward in their chairs, completely caught up in the tale. Near the end of the day, something unexpected happened. Sarah, a quiet girl who sat behind Li Wei in class, raised her hand. "Can I say something?" she asked. When the teacher nodded, Sarah stood up and said, "My family came from Vietnam last year. Could we maybe do a day like this for other cultures too?" Her voice was shaky but hopeful. More hands shot up. There was a boy from Mexico, another from India, and a girl whose parents came from Nigeria. They all wanted to share their stories too. Mr. Davis, who had been watching everything all day, stepped forward. His face showed that he was thinking hard about something. He looked at how the students were sitting together, talking and laughing, not in their usual separate groups, but all mixed up. He saw Katie and Li Wei working together, and other students asking Sarah about Vietnam. The principal realized that this day had done more than just teach students about Chinese culture. It had started to break down the walls between all the students. The next morning was completely different at Pine Tree School. When Li Wei walked into her classroom, instead of whispers and laughs, she heard "ni hao," hello in Chinese, from several students who had learned it yesterday. Katie, who was waiting by Li Wei's desk, had brought Chinese dumplings for lunch. She had asked her mom to buy them from Mrs. Lin's restaurant after school. During morning announcements, Mr. Davis shared some big news. The school would start a new program called Culture Share Fridays. Every Friday, students from different backgrounds would get a chance to share something about their culture. Sarah would lead the first one next week, teaching about Vietnamese Tet celebration. The Indian student, Raj, was already excited about showing everyone his mother's henna art the week after. In class, Mrs. Brown had another surprise. She started teaching simple math problems in both English and Chinese numbers, asking Li Wei to help. When some students struggled with a hard problem, Li Wei showed them a Chinese way of solving it. Tommy called it a math trick, and soon everyone wanted to learn it. Li Wei felt proud seeing her classmates using her method. During lunch break, the biggest change was visible. Li Wei didn't sit alone anymore. Her table was now full. Katie and her friends wanted to learn more Chinese words. Sarah shared her Vietnamese spring rolls, and other students asked about life in Shanghai. The lunchroom became louder with happy chatter in different languages, with students teaching each other words from their home countries. After school, Mr. Zhang came to pick up Li Wei and found her surrounded by friends. They were planning a weekend visit to Mrs. Lin's restaurant, where Li Wei promised to help them order in Chinese. As they walked to the car, they passed Mr. Davis talking to a group of parents. He was explaining his new idea, a monthly international food festival where families could share their traditional dishes with the whole school community. In the car ride home, Li Wei couldn't stop smiling as she told her father about her day. Mr. Zhang looked at his daughter. Her eyes were bright, her voice excited, and she was finally the happy girl he remembered from Shanghai. But neither of them knew that the biggest surprise was still to come, one that would make their story known far beyond Pine Tree School. The news about Pine Tree School's cultural transformation started spreading through the town. Local newspapers sent reporters to cover the Culture Share Fridays. They took pictures of Sarah teaching Vietnamese traditional dance, Raj's mother doing henna art demonstrations, and Li Wei showing Chinese calligraphy. The The school hallways, once plain and boring, were now decorated with student artwork from different cultures. The biggest surprise came one morning when a famous education magazine contacted Mr. Davis. They wanted to write about how one father's creative solution to bullying had changed an entire school. When they interviewed Mr. Zhang, he spoke humbly. "I just wanted my daughter to feel proud of who she is," he said. "I never expected it would help so many other children too." Li Wei became a different person at school. She started speaking up more in class, her English improving quickly now that she wasn't afraid to practice. She even volunteered to give a speech at the first International Food Festival, where over 200 parents and community members came to share their traditional foods. The same cafeteria where she once cried over spilled dumplings was now filled with happy families trying dishes from around the world. Katie, who had changed the most, stood up in front of everyone at the festival. With tears in her eyes, she apologized to Li Wei and other students she had hurt. "I was mean because I didn't understand," she said. "Now I know that having friends from different places makes life more interesting." She had even started taking weekend Chinese classes with Mrs. Wang. The school's test scores started improving too. Students were helping each other learn in new ways. Chinese students taught math tricks, Mexican students helped in Spanish class, and Indian students shared science knowledge from their weekend cultural schools. Teachers noticed that students who used to struggle were now doing better because they felt more confident. One day, Mr. Zhang received an important letter. The state education department wanted him to speak at a big teachers' conference. They wanted him to explain how Pine Tree School had become a model for handling cultural differences. Looking at the letter, Mr. Zhang remembered that scared day when Li Wei had texted him to come get her from school. He never imagined that his simple plan to help his daughter would end up helping so many others. At the teachers' conference, Mr. Zhang stood in front of hundreds of educators from different schools. He wasn't just a doctor today. He was a father sharing an important story. Li Wei sat in the front row, beaming with pride as her father began to speak. She was wearing the same red dress from their first culture day, but now she wore it with complete confidence. Mr. Zhang showed pictures and videos from Pine Tree School's transformation. The audience gasped when they saw the before and after pictures, from Li Wei sitting alone at lunch to the now bustling cafeteria, filled with students sharing food and stories. He showed clips from different culture share Fridays, Mexican students teaching the salsa dance, Nigerian students performing traditional drumming, and Korean students demonstrating taekwondo. But the most powerful part was when Katie joined them on stage. She had asked to come along to share her side of the story. "I was the bully," she said honestly, her voice shaking a little. "But now, Li Wei is one of my best friends. Last weekend I had dinner at her house, and her father taught me how to make dumplings from scratch." The audience clapped as Katie and Li Wei hugged on stage. The changes at Pine Tree School had gone far beyond just accepting different cultures. Test scores had gone up by 25%. Bullying incidents had dropped to almost zero. Other schools in the district started copying their program. The local college even sent student teachers to learn from their success. Mr. Davis proudly shared that Pine Tree School now had a waiting list of families wanting to transfer there. After the conference, something unexpected happened. A group of parents from different schools surrounded Mr. Zhang. They all had similar stories about their children feeling left out. One mother was crying as she thanked him, saying, "You've given us hope that things can change." Several school principals asked for his help to start similar programs in their schools. That evening, back at home, Li Wei found her father sitting quietly in their living room. "What are you thinking about, Baba?" she asked. Mr. Zhang smiled at his daughter. "I'm thinking about that day you texted me from the school bathroom," he said. "I was so angry and worried, but sometimes the worst days can lead to the best changes." Li Wei nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. But even as they celebrated their success, they didn't know that the biggest honor was still to come, one that would take their story all the way to the nation's capital. In early spring, a special letter arrived at the Zhang household. It had an official seal from Washington, D.C. Li Wei watched as her father's hands shook while opening it. Inside was an invitation that seemed almost unbelievable. The president's office wanted to honor Pine Tree School as a national example of cultural integration in education. The whole school buzzed with excitement. Everyone would be watching on TV as Mr. Zhang, Li Wei, Mr. Davis, and Katie were invited to the White House to receive a special education award. Mrs. Lin closed her restaurant for the day so everyone could watch together. The Chinese weekend school canceled classes. Every student at Pine Tree School gathered in the assembly hall to watch the ceremony on a big screen. At the White House, Li Wei could hardly believe she was really there. The same girl who once hid in the school bathroom was now walking through the grand halls of the nation's capital. She wore a beautiful Chinese qipao dress that Mrs. Wang had specially made for her. Katie stood beside her in a dress that mixed American and Chinese styles, showing how cultures could blend beautifully. During the ceremony, the president spoke about how Pine Tree School had become a model for the whole country. This school has shown us that our differences don't divide us. They make us stronger, the president said. Thanks to one father's creative solution and a community's willingness to change, they've created something remarkable. The cameras showed the audience crying when Li Wei and Katie went up together to share their story. Li Wei spoke confidently in English, no longer afraid of her accent. Katie talked about how learning about other cultures had made her a better person. Then they surprised everyone by saying a short speech together in Chinese, which they had practiced for weeks. Back in their town, watching on TV, Mrs. Lin's restaurant erupted in cheers. Sarah, Raj, and all their other friends jumped up and down with excitement. Even some of the older teachers had tears in their eyes. Pine Tree School wasn't just a school anymore. It had become proof that acceptance and understanding could change everything. But the most touching moment came when Mr. Zhang stepped up to receive the award. Instead of making a big speech, he simply said, "Sometimes love for our children can move mountains. All we need to do is be brave enough to try something new." He looked at Li Wei with tears in his eyes, remembering their journey from that difficult day to this proud moment. On their first day back at Pine Tree School, after the White House ceremony, Li Wei and her father were greeted by an amazing sight. The students and teachers had lined up along the school entrance, holding flags from every country represented at their school. Above the school door hung a new sign that read, "Welcome," in 20 different languages. The school had changed forever. 5 years later, when Li Wei was about to graduate from high school, Pine Tree School had become famous across the country. Over 50 schools had copied their cultural program. The waiting list to get into Pine Tree School was now 3 years long. Parents drove from other cities just to see how the school worked. Li Wei, now a confident teenager, gave tours to visitors, showing them the Hall of Cultures, a special hallway where every month a different student's culture was celebrated. She would point proudly to a framed photo near the principal's office. It showed her father's first cultural day, with little Li Wei in her red dress. Below it was the award from the White House. Katie had also grown in wonderful ways. She became the school's first Cultural Bridge president, helping new immigrant students feel welcome. She could now speak basic Chinese and was planning to study international relations in college. "Li Wei taught me that being kind is more important than being popular," she often said to new students. Mr. Zhang continued his work at the hospital, but he became known for more than just being a good doctor. Schools across the country invited him to speak about building cultural bridges. The simple plan he made at his kitchen table to help his daughter had grown into a movement that was changing schools everywhere. On Li Wei's graduation day, she gave a speech that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "5 years ago, I was a scared girl who couldn't find her place," she said. "Today, I realized that my father didn't just solve a problem. He showed us all how to turn fear into friendship and difference into strength." She ended by saying something in English, Chinese, Vietnamese, Spanish, and Hindi, the main languages now spoken at Pine Tree School. "Everyone belongs here." After the graduation ceremony, Mr. Zhang hugged his daughter tightly. "Are you proud of me, Baba?" Li Wei asked. Her father smiled, remembering everything they had been through. "I was always proud of you," he said, "but I'm more proud of what you helped create, a place where no child will ever feel like they don't belong." The story of Pine Tree School continues to inspire people today. It proves that sometimes the biggest changes start with one person being brave enough to stand up and say, "There's a better way." Li Wei and her father showed that acceptance and understanding aren't just nice words. They're the keys to making our world a better place, one school at a time. Now the story is complete. It shows how a difficult situation turned into positive change that kept growing and helping more people, leaving a lasting impact on not just one school, but many schools across the country.